Hello everyone. Today we will be covering the history of the little known but highly significant Russo-Turkish War, which was fought in the late 1870s. This war saw the resurgence of Russian military might after the Crimean War and symbolized the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's period of terminal decline. Russia exited the Crimean War with its territories intact, but the forced destruction of the Black Sea Fleet and naval bases lost the empire a great deal of its prestige and limited the ability of St. Petersburg to put pressure upon the Ottomans during the latter's period of reforms. Russian statesmen in the 1860s consistently attempted to overturn the terms of the Crimean peace agreement. For this reason, they supported Bismarck and his wars of German unification, as Prussia was the only ally the Russians had. This gambit paid off. Napoleon III's crushing defeat to the Prussians at Sedan ended the French threat to Russia, and in 1871 the international powers agreed to overturn the stipulation that Russia was not to be allowed a Black Sea fleet. Russia's renewed assertiveness in the Black Sea came at just a time when the Ottoman Empire was weakened. Ottoman debts, racked up during the Crimean War, had built up to such an extraordinary level that the government had been forced to default on its foreign loans. At the same time, the influx of refugees from the Crimean Peninsula and other parts of the Russian Empire into Ottoman lands put a strain upon already limited resources. Still, Russia could not declare war on the Ottomans, as the other European powers had guaranteed to protect the Sultan and would come to the empire's aid if it was attacked. British considerations, in particular, were key here. The Russians bided their time and waited for a moment of weakness, whilst at the same time sending agents into the Ottoman Empire's provinces to stir up trouble. Ottoman control was particularly tenuous in the Balkans. The province of Bosnia, at the far edge of the empire, had, ever since the 1850s, been largely in a continuous state of rebellion. Bosnia was divided between Muslims and Christians, most of whom identified themselves with nearby Serbia. The Muslim population owned much of the land and had access to most of the administrative jobs in the province, yet many poor peasants were also Muslims. As the Christian peasants grew restless, the Muslims in Bosnia sought to crack down on their rebelliousness with harsh measures, often without the prior consent of Istanbul. Attempts had been made in the 1860s to reform Bosnia, but this resulted in increased taxation. The peasants, especially Christian peasants, resented the new taxes. In 1874 there was a widespread famine following a crop failure, with many landlords now taking more than half of every meagre yield that the peasants could collect. Peasants in the region of Herzegovina, today part of Bosnia, began making preparations for an uprising in 1874 with the aid of nearby Montenegro. Montenegro was a tiny yet independent state in the West Balkans. When the Ottomans learned of this plot, they moved to arrest the leaders, but were unable to do so as the leaders fled either to Montenegro or to Austria-Hungary. An uprising then broke out in 1875 with bands of armed peasants attacking landlords and Ottoman soldiers. Adventurers, mostly Italians, began flocking to Bosnia to take part in this fight, which they perceived to be a battle against Islam. Soon backed by Serbia and Montenegro, the rebels gained control of Bosnia's rural regions, but the loyalist Turks retained control of the towns. A steady stream of refugees, Christians and Muslims, began fleeing from Bosnia in their droves. Nationalism in Bulgaria had been slower to develop than in Serbia, Montenegro and Bosnia, perhaps due to the proximity of Bulgaria to the center of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. In the Middle Ages there had existed numerous Bulgarian empires which had briefly dominated the Balkans, although the last Bulgarian state had disappeared in the early years of the 15th century, 450 years prior. Most Christians living in what had once been Bulgaria wrote and read in Greek and referred to themselves as Greeks. Slowly, however, through the use of oral tradition and a gradual rediscovery of old history, a Bulgarian national consciousness emerged. In 1869, a Bulgarian Revolutionary Central Committee was founded to advocate separation from both the Ottomans and the Greeks, and in 1870 an independent Bulgarian National Church was established. Following a tax hike, as well as evidence of Ottoman incompetence in crushing the Bosnian uprising, Bulgarian revolutionaries felt that the time was ripe for a nationalist insurrection in their country. Rebels seized a number of towns in the center of Bulgaria, particularly in the mountains. The number of Muslims killed in this uprising is disputed. What isn't disputed is that the crushing of the uprising by Ottoman troops and irregulars was immediate and bloody. Exact numbers of peasants killed and villages burnt are impossible to verify, but were likely in the tens of thousands. The killings were disastrous not only for the victims, but also for the international reputation of the Ottoman Empire. News of the massacres spread rapidly to Istanbul, and from there to the Western European capitals. Sensational stories spread of bayoneted babies and mass sexual assault. British public opinion was particularly offended, as the British were the open allies of the Ottoman Empire, and so many people blamed the Prime Minister, Disraeli, for the massacre, which became known as the Bulgarian Horror. Teams were assembled to travel to Bulgaria and report from location. Once they wrote back of beheaded corpses and burned villages, public opinion in London became incensed. Disraeli's parliamentary opponent, William Gladstone, attacked the Turkish people as a whole in a racist pamphlet and called for an anti-Ottoman policy to be introduced. His appeal was matched by writers such as Charles Dickens and Oscar Wilde, who pressured the government to take action. At the same time, as we have seen, a coup in Istanbul brought a new sultan to the throne. Serbia and Montenegro, despite being far smaller states than the Ottoman Empire, declared war on it, hoping to take advantage of the chaos and win full independence. The Serbian army was enthusiastic, but at the same time poorly trained, poorly equipped, and terribly led. The Ottomans, in contrast, were equipped with state-of-the-art British rifles and German artillery. Quickly the Serbs were pushed back, and the great powers forced a ceasefire. When the duration of this ceasefire ended, the Serbs attacked again and were thrown back even further. Russia then intervened to force the Sultan to stop his attack on the threat of invasion. The Russians now demanded that something be done and brought the powers together for a conference in Istanbul in December 1876. This conference was attended by delegates from Russia, Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Germany and Italy, but was dominated by the UK and Russia. The Russians proposed a large Bulgaria be established, including Macedonia, and the British attempted to create a small and weak Bulgaria, fearing that Russian interest in the new country. In the end, a compromise Bulgaria was decided upon. The Ottomans, however, then rejected the proposal, secretly encouraged to by the British. Russia subsequently declared war on the Ottoman Empire in April of 1877. The Ottomans, who had been pushed into opposing Russia by the British, now turned to their island ally for help. Disraeli, however, informed the Sultan that no help could be given due to the strength of anti-Turkish feeling in the UK. Austria-Hungary, hopeful of new conquests, also promised the Russians that they would not intervene. The war was no means destined to be a Russian victory, given that the Ottoman forces were well equipped and in full control of the Black Sea and possessed a series of extensive fortifications. Ottoman commanders, however, refused to take initiative in the war, allowing the Russians time to formulate a plan. The Russians and their Romanian allies crossed the Danube River in June 1877, picking a crossing spot far from the Ottoman forts on the Black Sea coast. The Russians then wheeled inland, cutting off the Black Sea forts and advancing on Istanbul. The Russians failed, however, to take the important fortress city of Plevna in a quick assault, and the siege of Plevna soon became the central battle of the war. The Ottoman infantry's Winchester rifles, purchased from the US, enacted a fearsome toll upon the Russians. The Ottomans could have counterattacked early in the battle and driven the Russians from the field, but they cautiously stayed put and waited for Russian and Romanian reinforcements to arrive. Meanwhile, a relief army from Istanbul was prevented from reaching the fortress by a Bulgarian guerrilla force attacking it from the mountains. Slowly, the Russians and Romanians strangled Plevna's supplies, and, after an attempt to escape from the fortress failed in December 1877, the garrison finally surrendered. The Ottomans had failed to hold Plevna, but their brave defense against the odds had won many admirers in Europe and helped convince the great powers to intervene. Moreover, instead of taking Istanbul in a quick 2-month offensive, the Russians had been forced into a longer war. Seeing that the bulk of Ottoman forces were caught up in the East Balkans, the Serbians resumed their war against the empire. Forbidden from marching north or west by the Austro-Hungarians, the Serbian soldiers marched south, defeating a series of Ottoman forces who defended key locations but did not take to the offensive. In the Caucasus Mountains, Russian successes were not as notable as in other wars against the Ottomans in the region, although the Russian army did succeed in taking the fortress of Kars and annexed some land along the Black Sea coast. In Bulgaria, after another failed Ottoman offensive in the Bulgarian mountains, the Russians advanced west with the aid of local Bulgarian guides, crossed the mountains, and took the important city of Sofia in early January 1788. Russian, Romanian, and Bulgarian soldiers then swung around behind Ottoman lines and marched quickly and almost unopposed toward Istanbul. At this point, the great powers, particularly Britain, intervened decisively. The British sent a large fleet of battleships to Istanbul to deter the Russians from entering the city. As a result, the Russian forces stopped their advance 10 miles west in the suburb of San Stefano. Here, in March, they signed a treaty with the Ottomans which gave lands to Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, but most notably also created a giant Bulgaria. This was unacceptable to the powers, who feared that the new Bulgaria would be little more than a Russian puppet. Germany's Chancellor Bismarck diffused the situation, calling all the powers to Berlin to decide upon the fate of the Balkans in a great conference. Bismarck's aims were to keep the peace in Europe, and to stabilize the European states from domestic disturbances and radicalism. He thus sought to balance the competing interests of the other conference members, who all wished to block Russia's expansion. The end result was a conference which granted Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, and Bulgaria full independence. The former three countries all received lands, but the massive Bulgaria of San Stefano was now gone, replaced by a rump state north of the Balkan Mountains. Bulgarian nationalists were embittered and demanded revenge. Although Bulgaria would slowly expand over the years, it would never hold Macedonia for longer than 5 years, and the constant warfare the country partook in gave it a reputation as a militarist aggressor. East Rumelia, with a large Turkish and Greek population, was given semi-independence. Bosnia and Herzegovina were occupied by the Austro-Hungarians, although not fully annexed for another 30 years. Ottoman rule was restored to Macedonia, but it was tenuous and rickety in many areas. Observers expected another showdown to occur in just a couple of decades, and indeed they would not be disappointed.